Good evening, wanderer of strange fascinations. Or perhaps I should say, brave soul, for what you're about to hear is not polished with the rose gold of chivalry, nor scented with the incense of honor. No, this story rots, and not metaphorically. It stinks literally, historically, grotesquely. Because tonight, we step into the armor. We lace up the greaves, strap the mail to our thighs, wrap the body in hardened steel and sweat, and we don't come out clean. No hero emerges from this tale, scrubbed and shining. They emerge chafed, infected, oozing, and perhaps worst of all worshipped. We begin not with a trumpet, but with a stench. You've seen them, haven't you? In romantic paintings and glimmering films, the noble knight in full regalia, galloping toward righteousness, his armor polished like the surface of a still lake, his sword slicing cleanly through injustice. But the truth is rarely that cinematic. Truth, in this case, is sticky and bacterial. Truth lives in the folds of flesh beneath chainmail that hasn't come off in weeks. Truth smells like open sores and decaying food crusted to the lining of a helmet. Truth is a fungal kingdom growing in the dark crevice between ambition and the human armpit. You see, the medieval knight, our icon of valor and discipline, was perhaps one of the filthiest creatures to have ever been knighted by history casts selective memory. Let me ask you this. Have you ever worn a tight-fitting shirt on a summer day? Ever felt it cling to your back with a combination of sweat and shame? Now imagine that shirt is made of metal. Imagine you can't take it off. Not for a bath, not for sleep, not even for a latrine. Because removing it means vulnerability, and vulnerability means death. And death means dishonor, and worse still, it means someone else gets the glory. So they wore it, and kept wearing it, day in, day out, for weeks. It didn't matter if the knight was camped in mud, marching through cold rain, or festering in the heat of a crusade under the blazing Levantine sun. The armor stayed on. Sweat soaked the padded gambeson beneath it. The gambeson soaked the linen shirt beneath that. All of it mashed against unwashed flesh, like a pressure cooker of medieval microbiomes. And it wasn't long before the body began to rebel. Chafing gave way to open wounds. Skin rubbed raw began to bleed, then to swell. The combination of friction, heat, and moisture created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Not just any bacteria, real, medieval, death by infection bacteria. The kind that didn't give you a rash. It gave you a slow and painful fever, the kind that ended in pus, blackened flesh, and possibly a burial attended only by flies. But that wasn't the only thing trapped inside the knight's armor. Have you considered the matter of waste, human waste? Because when a knight took to battle, he didn't have the convenience of a timeout for a toilet break. There were no porta-castles along the front lines. Armor took hours to put on, strapped, buckled, tied, secured by squires with practiced fingers. And so when the bladder or bowels made their call, the knight answered in place. Yes, they relieved themselves in their armor. Some knights fought entire battles, standing in their own urine. Others marched for miles with diarrhea sloshing against their thighs, unable to stop, because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant being trampled under hoof and ambition. And still, we praise them. We name schools and beers and football teams after them. We put their crests on shields and their faces in museums. But we forget that behind every legend lies a pair of moldy socks and a crotch rash from hell. Would you still want to be a knight, knowing that your glory might come with lice in your eyebrows and maggots feasting in your boots? Because the lice came too. Oh yes, and the fleas, and the ticks. You must remember, this was not an age of hot showers and antiseptics. This was the time of wipe with whatever's dry. Knights rarely bathed, not out of laziness, but out of belief. There was a deeply held fear that too much bathing could weaken the body, open the pores to demons and death. Water, they thought, was to be avoided, especially if warm and comforting. A knight might wash his face once in a while, perhaps rinse his hands after bloodshed, but a full bath? That was for the sick, the idle, or the dead. Instead, they powdered. Yes, they had powders made of chalk, ash, crushed herbs, sprinkled inside their armor like some desperate attempt to perfume the rot. It didn't work. The powders clumped with sweat and turned to paste. That paste then molded. Mold that grew in the shadows of shoulder joints and groin plates. A quiet infestation of green and gray, thriving on the constant damp. And when the armor finally did come off, the smell alone could knock a squire unconscious. Stories are told unconfirmed, but often repeated of knights fainting upon being undressed after long campaigns. Their skin, unexposed to light or air for so long, had changed color. Fungal patches the size of dinner plates. Infected boils that burst on contact with fabric. In some cases, the armor had fused to the skin rusted into the very wounds it helped to create. But let's return to the camps, shall we? Because glory isn't only earned on the battlefield, it is also fermented in the filth of preparation. Imagine a knight's tent, if you dare. A small enclosed space reeking of old wounds and meat gone bad. Inside, the knight might sleep in his armor if danger loomed. Or perhaps he'd strip the upper half, exposing a torso covered in scabs and bruises, muscles knotted with overexertion, breath sour from mead and missing teeth. Around him, lice crawled freely. In the linens, in the straw-stuffed bedding, in the musty cloak he used as a blanket. The squire, poor soul, shared that space tasked with cleaning, oiling, feeding, dressing, and occasionally lancing the boils on his master's back. Imagine being that squire. You're 13, maybe 14. Your hands blistered from polishing steel, your nose permanently wrinkled from the stench. You dream of one day becoming a knight, of earning your own armor. But for now, you are the keeper of another man's rot. And still, they fought. They charged into battle with disease under their skin and vermin in their hair. Because the only thing worse than dying in filth was dying in obscurity. You see, glory has a scent, too. It smells like sweat and steel and something darker, something decayed. The medieval knight carried that scent like a perfume of purpose. The more he stank, the more battles he had seen. The worse the wounds, the louder the tales. And no matter how putrid he became, the bards never sang of his sores. But we will. Tonight, we tell it all. We peel back the visor, not to reveal a handsome jawline, but a festering abscess beneath the cheekbone. We unbuckle the chest plate to find cloth soaked with old blood and new sweat. We reach into the greaves and pull out not valor, but fungus. Because history has been too kind to the knight. It has scrubbed him clean. Tonight, we bring the dirt back. We honor not the image, but the infection. So, are you ready? Are you truly ready to smell what lies beneath the myth? Because the truth, dear listener, is not gallant. It is gangrenous. And it begins with armor. The first thing they lost was not their honor, nor their courage, nor even their sanity. No, the first thing to rot from a knight's body was always the skin behind the knees. Strange, isn't it? That something so small, so unheroic, would be the first to whisper betrayal beneath the steel tomb they willingly sealed themselves in. It always began there, where the flesh folds into itself, where the heat collects, and has nowhere to go, where sweat curdles into something that no longer smells like the human body, but like a dying one. You would never read that in the chivalric romances. No troubadour ever sang a verse to the festering crease of Sir Geoffrey's leg. But I will, because beneath the banners and crests and holy vows, the knight was a man. And a man trapped in metal is not a statue. He is a furnace, and that furnace never cooled. Not even at night, when the fire of battle dimmed. The heat lingered, pressed into him by padded linen, soaked in layers of his own making. The gambeson, which the poets never mention, was not white. Not for long. It was once a clean canvas. But soon it became a journal, recording every moment of agony in color. Yellowed sweat stains, rust burns from wet steel, crusts of dried blood, streaks of feces hurriedly wiped when duty would not wait. And beneath it, his own skin rebelled. But oh, they thought they were invincible in those suits. Like gods among peasants, they marched with the weight of iron, thinking it shielded them from death. It didn't. It only disguised the way they decayed, because the rot always starts from the inside, not just philosophically, biologically. It was the trapped heat, the constant friction, the never-ending pressure against places that were never meant to be armored. The thighs rubbing until the skin peeled. The armpits swelling with boils so ripe they burst like overripe fruit when a strap was tightened. The scalp crawling with lice beneath a coif that hadn't been washed since Pentecost. Even the crevices of their ears collected mold, thick green moss-like fuzz that festered in silence, because who would dare inspect the ear of a knight? That would be unseemly. And so the fungus grew, quiet and victorious. They trained for glory, yes. From the age of 7, some of them. They learned to ride, to joust, to pray before killing. But no one taught them how to bleed with grace when their inner thigh was blistered raw, and every step felt like being flayed from the inside. No one wrote ballads for the moment. A knight realized the wetness in his boot was not water, but pus leaking from an ankle sore. And still they walked. And still they fought. Because that was the code. Not the code of chivalry. No. The code of rot. You wear the armor. You suffer in silence. You win the battle. You rot later. There was no romantic ritual when the armor went on. It was not sacred. It was labor. The squire lifted the cuirass, already rusted at the edges from yesterday's sweat. He tied the straps with cracked fingers. He ignored the smell, the way it clung to his throat and made him gag silently when his lord wasn't looking. That smell, my God, that smell was not simply bad. It was wrong. It was ancient meat. It was old blood. It was fermented arrogance and decaying discipline. And every day, it got worse. Layer upon layer, like the rings of a tree. But instead of age, it marked infection. Deep, secret infection. Let me tell you what happened inside the helmet. Not just the battles fought in there, but the slow suffocation of sense. The visor let in light, but not air. The mouth breathed, but only what it had already breathed before. It was a self-contained swamp. The knight's breath came back to him, hotter each time, until he felt his own lungs turn on him. His lips blistered, his tongue thickened. Saliva pooled in his beard and turned sour, mixing with the dried food crusted to his chin. The inside of a helmet was a petri dish, and no one ever thought to clean it. They simply wore it again, and again, and again. The eye slits narrowed, not from design, but from grime. And still they charged forward, blind, rotting, and revered. Their teeth? Have we spoken of their teeth yet? No, of course not. Because the stories don't too want you to imagine Sir Bertrand of Gascony with brown stumps where his pride should be. They don't too want you to hear the wit click of tooth against tooth as he chewed tough meat with a jaw inflamed by gum disease. They don't want you to picture him spitting blood into his gauntlet, wiping it absently on his cloak, and muttering a prayer not for his soul, but for the toothache that had kept him awake for 6 nights. No one carved that into stained glass, but it happened. It happened more than the dragon slaying. And then there was the groin. Gods help us, the groin. The armor that was cruel. A metal codpiece, tight and unyielding, pressing against a place that only ever bloomed in freedom. Inside, the heat grew unbearable. Urine sometimes couldn't escape fast enough. It pooled, then scalded. The skin blistered. The smell became personal each night, had his own bouquet of decay. Some with more sourness, some with earthy tones, some with a sharp, unmistakable tang of meat gone green. And they knew it. They smelled themselves. But what could they do? Stop the war? Delay the tournament to air out a crotch? Never. Pride was stronger than stench. Until the flesh began to rot. Yes, some knights rotted alive. Gangrene would take the toes first, then the heel. The foot, blackened and bulbous, oozing with every step, still shoved into a boot, because the mission must continue. Squires would cry, quietly, as they peeled the boot off at night, skin coming with it. Sometimes entire toes fell off in their hands, and they would wrap them in cloth and bury them outside the tent, silently, respectfully, as if they were limbs of a saint, but they weren't saints. They were men who wore tombs as clothing, and somehow the armor made them invincible in the minds of those who watched from afar. From the castle towers, the peasants cheered. "Look at Sir Alling, how he glows in the sun," they'd say. They couldn't smell him from the parapet. They couldn't see the rash beneath his arms, the lice dancing in his hair, the blood caked in the seam of his greave. They only saw the shine. And that was enough. But you and I, we are not on the parapet. We are here in the tent, as the armor comes off and the truth leaks out. We are the witnesses to what the scribes omitted. We hear the knight groan as the chainmail pulls a scab from his shoulder blade. We see the infection under his toenail, green and angry. We smell the rot in his boots and the perfume trying in vain to mask it. We are here when he weeps, not from fear, not from loss, but from the simple agony of movement. His body is no longer a temple. It is a battlefield in its own right. And yet, he dons it again the next day, because the real sickness was not in his skin. It was in the belief that this suffering was noble, that the more he bled, the more he itched, the more he reeked, the closer he was to God's favor. Pain, they said, purified the soul. Perhaps, but it defiled the body. And that defilement was not swift. It was slow, so slow you hardly noticed it. One sore today, a boil tomorrow, a limp by week's end, a stink that wouldn't leave, a fever that refused to break, and then the shaking, the sweating, the slipping out of consciousness during Mass, the sudden collapse after battle, the burial without mourning because no one wanted to smell him anymore. Still want to be a knight? Then know this. Glory always came with a price. And that price was flesh. Not sacrificed in a single heroic moment, but peeled away day by day, like bark from a dying tree. Glory came with rot, and the knight paid in full. You know what's worse than a knight who stinks alone? 100 knights who stink together. A battalion of bravado, packed shoulder to shoulder inside the damp canvas of a campaign tent, leather creaking, steel groaning, and the air so thick with the breath of decay that even the flies gag. If the battlefield was a stage for glory, the camp was a fermentation chamber for disease. And not just any disease, but the kind that doesn't kill quickly, no, that would be too kind. These were slow, whispering afflictions that started in the marrow and ended in madness. The kind that made a man forget his own prayers, that turned his vision yellow, that made his fingers tremble, not from fear, but from rot in his blood. The knight, stripped of his illusion, sat among his own kind men of iron on the outside, mush on the inside. They sat in silence, mostly. No one wanted to speak too long in that heat. Every breath was a gamble. Say too much, and your mouth would dry, your cracked lips would split, and the salt of your own blood would sting like vinegar. So they grunted, they gestured, and they endured. Because conversation was a luxury reserved for clean mouths, and these mouths had not tasted clean in months. Their tongues were coated in the remains of dried beef, old ale, and the mold that comes when you sleep with your mouth open, and the nights are wet with mildew. You could scrape it with a dagger, and still the taste of copper and bile would remain. There was no brushing, no rinsing, no mint to mask the breath that could knock over a goat at 10 paces. Only the occasional chew of parsley or mint leaf, if a squire had been clever or cruel enough to stash some. But even that didn't work for long. The smell always came back. The camp reeked like a mass grave pretending to be a brotherhood. And still they huddled close. Because cold killed faster than infection, and they were not foolish. They knew the devil could take you in the night, not with a sword, but with a shiver that turned your blood to frost and your heart to stone. So they shared blankets, shared sweat, shared the warmth of rotting bodies, packed like spoiled fruit in a basket of ambition. They didn't fear it. They called it fellowship. But it was fungus by any other name. The bedding, if it could be called that, was little more than straw, old cloaks, and whatever they could steal from the dead. Death, after all, was the only supplier with endless stock. And so, one man's funeral became another's mattress. They laid upon it, hoping the lice would take longer to migrate than the fever. They didn't. Lice moved like rumors in a monastery fast, hungry and impossible to contain. They infested every layer, every seam, every fold of cloth, and nestled deep in the parts of the body that no armor protected. The groin, the backside, the crown of the head, places sacred and shameful. And when the itching began, there was no escape. You could scratch until you bled, and they would still be there, dancing in your wounds. Some tried to boil their clothes. But boiling meant fire. Fire meant wood. Wood meant money or trees or time, none of which a knight had in surplus. So they sweated it out. They endured the crawling, the biting, the eggs laid in crevices they had long stopped washing. And when they removed their shirts at night, the lice did not scatter. They clung. They belonged now. They were part of the armor beneath the armor, the unofficial heraldry of the damned. Food made it worse, because food always makes rot louder. It began with meat, as it always does, too salty, too dry, too old. Sometimes it came with weevils, sometimes with worms. No one cared. A knight needed calories, not comfort. So he ate what didn't crawl too fast. Bread that had gone green. Cheese so pungent it could fight back. Dried fruit rehydrated in stale wine. And always the stew. Always that cursed, bottomless stew pot, boiling over with whatever had been thrown in last. Rat, onion, boot leather, a coin for luck, who knew? It all tasted the same, bland, bitter, and slightly metallic, but the body never forgets. And what goes in must come out, which brings us, inevitably, to the trench. They called it a latrine, a pit dug behind the camp, sometimes shielded by a curtain, more often not. It stank like betrayal, like the innards of men who had eaten guilt and regret. There was no toilet paper, no linen wipes, just grass, if you were lucky, a rag, if you were blessed, your own hand, if not. And the flies knew. They lived there, in swarms so thick you had to wave your arms just to see where to squat. They bit, they laid eggs, and sometimes they flew back with you, into your tent, into your food, into your wounds. Do you understand now that a knight did not simply fight battles? He lived in one. A constant war with his own body, with his own filth, with the biology that clawed at the seams of his strength. He was not made for this. No one was. But pride has a way of making the unbearable look like duty. And so he bore it, silently. Because complaining meant weakness, and weakness was a faster death than any sword. Some sought solace in rituals. Daily prayers, whispered with cracked lips. A small carving of a saint, tucked into a belt pouch. A scrap of their mother's scarf, still faintly sweet from years ago. Tiny acts of rebellion against the stink. But faith can only perfume so much. It cannot cleanse a body soaked in 3 weeks of fever sweat. It cannot bandage a foot that has begun to smell like fish. It cannot reverse the maggots. Yes, maggots. There were tales always whispered, always at night of wounds so deep, so long neglected, that maggots made homes in them. And some nights let them stay, because the maggots, they said, ate only the dead flesh. They were surgeons in their own horrific way. Tiny, wriggling healers sent by God or fate, or just the cruel logic of nature. It wasn't noble, but it worked, sometimes. And then there was the moment, the quiet horror. The knight felt nothing. Not numbness from the cold, but the kind of nothing that meant the flesh was no longer his. That the skin on his calf had gone cold, waxy, that it did not hurt when he pressed it, that when he poked it with his dagger, it did not bleed, only oozed, slowly, thickly, like sap from a dying tree. That was when he knew. The rot had taken root. Still, he would rise the next day, because the banner had not yet fallen, because the squire still looked at him with wide, stupid eyes, because the priest still blessed him before battle, because he still believed, somewhere beneath the stink, that he was chosen, that if he died today, the songs would ignore the smell, that the bards would never mention the pus, only the courage. And so he stood, wrapped himself in metal and pain, stepped over the trench, mounted the horse, and disappeared into the fog of war, trailing a scent that only the crows understood. There comes a point when the body stops warning you, when the screams of skin become murmurs, when the swelling learns to live in silence, when the bruises no longer shout in purple, but lie down and fade to yellow like tired ghosts. The knight knew this stage well, though he never spoke of it. None of them did. It was the pact unspoken, that pain is permitted, but pity is treason. And so when the armpits bubbled with cysts, when the groin oozed something foul and unfamiliar, when the gums bled unprovoked and the throat refused to swallow without fire, he did not ask why. He only asked, how much longer? Not out loud. Never out loud. Only in the lonely courtroom of his skull, where every answer came back in the voice of his father, his priest, or worse, his own. There was a rhythm to the rot, a cadence so precise it might have been called liturgical if it weren't so unholy. It began with friction, always friction. The steel kissed the cloth caressed the skin, and the skin rebelled. Day after day, the knight walked, rode, knelt, thrust, and staggered. The body didn't heal, because it was never given time. A scab was not a conclusion, it was a target. One more thing to rip open beneath the weight of devotion. One more offering to the gods of metal and mud. And so the rot marched with him, not as a punishment, but as a companion. It whispered in his joints, tickled his spine, gnawed at the edges of his fingernails. It did not scream for attention. It sighed, coiled, and claimed. And then came the rain. Rain turned everything honest. The armor, once burnished and boastful, revealed its age. Rust bloomed along the edges like a fever rash, spreading from rivet to rim, eating away the pride of its surface. Water seeped through every seam, soaking the gambeson beneath, turning linen to sludge, padding to sponge. And inside, the night steamed like meat in a pot. The dampness did not cool him, it boiled him. His skin puckered, his fingers swelled. His boots filled with water that refused to drain, and so his feet became fish, slick and soft and stinking. Trench foot before trenches. Decay by design. He could feel the fabric separating from his flesh, not gently, but with the slow resistance of something that knows it's wrong. When he peeled off his socks, if they still resembled socks, they came with pieces of heel, with the smell of death incubated by ambition. He never let anyone see. Not the squire, not the chaplain, not even the horse. He changed them in the dark, gritting his teeth as the cloth tore away skin, and stuffed the mess into the fire pit, where it hissed like a snake and vanished. No one asked what burned. No one wanted to know. Somewhere between the rain and the fever, The knight began to lose time. Hours slipped through his hands like loose chainmail. He'd wake in the mud with no memory of lying down. He'd speak in tongues, not his own. He forgot names, then faces, then prayers. The others noticed. They spoke of it at night, their voices hushed with fear disguised as reverence. He communes with God, they whispered. The angels speak through his mouth. But the truth was simpler. The rot had reached his brain. It crept through his bloodstream like an opportunist at court, taking seat after seat until the throne of sense itself bowed in surrender. And yet they still followed him, because madness and sainthood were often mistaken for one another in those days. A man who bled and wept and muttered to stars was not seen as broken. He was seen as blessed. A knight who bore his illness without question became a beacon. The worse he smelled, the more holy they believed him to be. The more he groaned in his sleep, the more sacred they said his dreams must be. They didn't see the fungus curling under his toenails, or the rash climbing his neck like ivy. They saw devotion. And so they copied him. Soon the entire company stank like salvation. They stopped cleaning their weapons. The rust, they claimed, was a sign of humility. They left their sores uncovered, said the flies were drawn to saints. They let their lice run wild and called it discipline. What had begun as neglect had now become ritual. What had begun as suffering had become scripture. And so the rot grew bold. It moved from skin to soul. It infected loyalty. It corroded judgment. The knights began to look at peasants not as people, but as vessels lesser containers of lesser pain. They mocked the washerwomen who flinched at their smell. They punished squires who wept while boiling their masters' bandages. They called it toughening, but it was just projection. The knight, who had once fought dragons in his youth, now created dragons from his own rot and fed them his humanity. He beat his horse when it faltered. He struck his squire for speaking too loud. He stopped praying before battle, not out of doubt, but because he believed he had become prayer itself. And every time a peasant turned away from his stench, he smiled, because revulsion was power. He had learned that glory didn't need perfume, it needed presence. And his presence filled every space like mold in a monastery wall. The worst of it came not in battle, but in rest. During peace, the rot had room to bloom. Without distraction, the knight could feel the exact moment his molars began to loosen. He could track the slow curl of his spine as abscesses made sitting unbearable. He could taste the iron in his saliva, growing stronger each day until every swallow felt like chewing pennies soaked in vinegar. And still, he refused to rest. Rest was for the weak, and he was not weak. He was just transforming. When the bishop came to bless the encampment, he recoiled. Not visibly, he was too trained for that, but inwardly, unmistakably. The knight saw it. He saw the flicker of nausea behind holy eyes. And it pleased him. For once, a man of God had smelled the truth, had tasted it on the air, and known it for what it was. Glory, rotted. The knight knelt anyway, bones creaking like old floorboards. The bishop anointed his brow, not knowing that beneath the chainmail hood, the knight's scalp was a tapestry of lesions. That the oil pooled in craters of flesh, where hair had long since abandoned its post. That the benediction now served not as a blessing, but as seasoning. Still, the bishop spoke the words, and the knight rose with a grin. Later that night, he vomited blood behind the latrine. No one saw, or perhaps no one cared. And yet, dawn found him mounted again, pale, shaking, eyes glassy, but upright, always upright. Because in a world where weakness smelled like lavender and roses, only the reek of death earned respect. There is a silence that comes after enough pain, a silence, not of peace, but of exhaustion. The knight had entered that silence long before the rest of the world noticed. He no longer flinched at the sound of bones. grinding inside their sockets, no longer blinked at the drip of blood from his nose. Every morning no longer cared when his vision blurred at sunset and did not return until late morning. He had become a shape rather than a man, a symbol more than a story. When the wind moved, it carried not his voice, but his scent, an announcement more powerful than any trumpet, more unforgettable than any herald's cry. And though he walked slower now, every footstep still crushed the earth with the same certainty, because the ground did not need his strength, it only recognized his rot. There were rumors among the squires, spoken in low voices over stolen bread crusts and dried figs. They said their knight no longer slept, that he sat all night, still as a corpse, staring at the wall of the tent with breath shallow as mist. They dared each other to look. One did. He came back with tears in his eyes and never spoke again. What he saw, no one could say. Only that the knight had turned his head, slowly, deliberately, and smiled with lips too cracked to move naturally. The kind of smile that doesn't mean joy, or kindness, or even menace, but simply knowledge. The kind that knows the smell of death not as a threat, but as a mirror. His armor was no longer armor. It was a second skin, permanent, irremovable, inseparable from his story. Rust had sealed certain joints, making it impossible to remove the greaves without tearing flesh. The pauldron had fused with the scab on his left shoulder, and every attempt to dislodge it invited a scream he refused to give. So it stayed. All of it stayed. The armor was not cleaned, not polished, not blessed. It was a tomb he carried proudly, each plate an ossuary for forgotten skin cells, old infections, and dreams he no longer visited. The smell had matured, like a cheese left too long in the sun, no longer sharp, but complex, layered, philosophical even. It did not assault. It lingered. It claimed. The horses noticed. They twitched when he approached. His own steed, once loyal and fearless, now whinnied low when he neared, eyes rolling just slightly, as if it sensed something unholy beneath the man. Animals know. They know when a man carries rot, not just on him, but inside him. But they obeyed, because fear and training are stronger than instinct when bred deep enough. And so the beast knelt, reluctantly, and bore him to the field once more. It was on the 7th day of the siege when the knight collapsed, not from a wound, not from an arrow or sword or even a curse, but from within. He was walking across the camp when his right leg simply stopped being a leg. It folded like wet parchment. He fell silently, no gasp, no groan. The squires rushed forward, expecting an injury. They rolled him over and saw nothing. No fresh blood, no break. But the smell was different. It had shifted, gained weight, gained finality. The physician was called. He tapped the soles of the knight's feet. No response. He pricked the thighs. No twitch. He leaned close and whispered the last rites, though the knight was not dead. Not yet, but the physician knew. The rot had touched the spine. They brought a cot, carried him into the command tent, laid him out like a relic, like something sacred and contaminated. The men came, one by one, to see, to pay respects while pretending he was still alive. Some wept, some prayed. One or two simply looked and walked away quickly. The squire knelt at the side, wiping his master's brow with a damp cloth, even though it left streaks of filth instead of cleansing anything. The knight's eyes were open the entire time, dry, red, but lucid. He saw them. He knew. That night, they did not remove the armor. They feared what might come out. The knight lay there, breathing through his mouth, chest barely rising, the steel he wore now tighter than ever. His hand twitched once, as if grasping for a sword, and then stilled. But he didn't die. Not yet. He hovered. And as he hovered, so did the past. Because that's what rot does, doesn't it? It preserves, in its own awful way. It traps the essence of everything sweat, pain, ritual, vanity, and seals it in place, like flies in amber. The knight was no longer a man. He was memory wrapped in infection. He was history's lie made flesh. They didn't bury him the next day. They couldn't. He wasn't dead. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't cry. But his eyes followed you. And that was enough to stop most from lingering too long. They moved the cot to a separate tent, far from the food, far from the other men, and left the candle burning beside him day and night. A priest was assigned to pray. He lasted 3 nights before begging to be reassigned. The smell, he said. The silence. The staring. It is like praying beside a statue that breathes, he whispered. And I do not think the breath is his. The rot, of course, was not idle. It took the opportunity. Spread into places it had only whispered through before. His stomach began to bloat. His fingers curled into claws. The skin on his chest blistered, split, healed, and split again. Pus leaked from under his chin guard. One eye sealed shut with yellow crust. The other remained open, wide, furious, and unblinking. They called for a bishop. He refused to enter the tent, sent a blessing from outside, and instructed them to prepare for either exorcism or embalming, whichever came first. And then, without warning, he stood. On the 5th night of his stasis, the knight stood. No one saw it happen. One moment he was on the cot. The next, he was at the entrance of the tent, armor groaning like an old door, body trembling but upright. The priest, returning with water, dropped the bowl and fled. The noise brought others. They came running, expecting fire, perhaps demons, but it was only him. And he walked. Through the camp, past the tents, past the fire pits. The men parted, not because they were ordered to, but because they felt they should. Something inside them, the same part that knows when lightning is near, told them to move. And so they did. No one asked where he was going. No one tried to stop him. They simply watched as the knight, reeking, dripping, barely more than bone and rust, walked toward the chapel. He knelt at the altar, slowly, painfully. The armor creaked, cracked. A piece of it fell, no one dared touch it. He folded his hands, bowed his head, and stayed that way until morning. When the sun rose, he was still there, motionless, silent, a statue in steel. They approached carefully. The squire reached first, touched the backplate. It was cold. Too cold. The priest stepped closer, whispered a prayer, reached beneath the visor, and closed the knight's eyes. The thing about death is that it rarely ends anything. Not really, especially not for a knight. His breath may cease, his pulse may falter, but the image, the rot-stained illusion of glory he carried like a halo of rust, lingers far beyond the last heartbeat. And so, as the sun carved its way across the sky, bleeding light through the chapel windows, the men did not see a corpse. They saw a relic, and relics are not buried. They are revered, worshipped, feared, even if they stink. They left him there for 3 days. Some said it was custom. Others claimed it was sacred instinct. But the truth was no one dared touch him. The armor had become a shrine to something they didn't want to admit, that the body inside was no longer just a body. It was a warning. The smell told the story. Stronger now, thicker. It clung to the chapel walls, soaked into the stone, made the candles flicker as if the very air rejected the presence. But still they came, not many, just a few brave enough to kneel. And even they kept their distance. The bravest approached only far enough to say a name. Not his name, their own. As if confessing to the dead what they could not say to the living. By the 4th morning, the priest demanded the body be moved. He was hoarse, eyes ringed in sleepless purple. His prayers had begun to sound more like bargains than blessings. He would pause mid-verse, forget words, stare at the figure of the knight, and murmur things not written in scripture. When asked what troubled him, he simply shook his head. "It listens," he whispered. That was all. So they sent the squires. 4 of them, each young, each trying to be brave. They came in with cloth tied across their mouths, hands trembling despite the armor they wore as imitation. When they approached, something strange happened. The room grew colder. Not in some dramatic ghost tale way, but in a real biting sense, as if the air had turned against them. One of the boys dropped his helmet. It clanged, loud and shameful. No one laughed. They tried to lift him. He didn't move, not easily. The armor had swollen. The rust had spread. The body inside had begun its ancient rebellion gases, expanding, fluids seeping, joints locking into grotesque final poses. And still, no one dared open the visor, not even a glance. They touched the steel only through cloth. They carried him on a litter, shoulders bowed, steps uneven. As they passed through the camp, the men turned their backs, not out of disrespect, but because they could not bear the sight of what they too might become. They buried him beyond the tree line, under a crooked oak that had never quite recovered from a lightning strike years before. The ground was soft, too soft. The grave filled with water before they finished digging. They hesitated, but the priest insisted. There would be no tomb, no stone, no name. Just earth. Earth and the silence of rot meeting rot. When the armor touched the mud, the squire closest to it gagged so hard he bled from his nose. The others said nothing. They covered the body in layers. First soil, then stones, then silence. But the smell stayed. It lingered in the tents, in the chapel, in the dreams of those who had known him. Men began to wake gasping, clutching at invisible wounds. They scratched themselves raw, sure they felt lice that weren't there. They refused to wear their armor for longer than an hour. One broke down weeping, convinced his own grief was whispering to him. The commander ordered the camp moved 2 miles east. It didn't help. The memory followed, and not just memory repetition, because soon another night began to cough. Not a simple cough, not the kind born of dust or drink, but deep, rattling, wet, the kind that tastes like pennies and ends in sleep and never quite restores. They tried to hide it. He rode anyway, fought anyway, but they knew. The rot had chosen its next altar. It was always like that. One goes, another follows. Not because of contagion, not in the medical sense, but because belief is contagious. They had seen a man rot into glory, and something inside them, a twisted sense of purpose, maybe, believed it was the only path left. If cleansing did not bring them closer to heaven, maybe decay would. The second night did not fight the rot. He leaned into it. He stopped shaving, stopped eating clean, refused to wash his hands before Mass. When the priest warned him, he laughed. God doesn't mind dirt, he said. He made me from it. And in that logic, he found armor stronger than steel, faith in filth, salvation through suffering. Soon others followed. They spoke less, smiled less. They wore their armor to bed, let their wounds fester. One man rubbed mud into a gash, claiming it would teach the body to obey. Another began storing maggots in a pouch just in case. They had seen a knight transcend the flesh by letting it fall away. And they wanted that transcendence. They wanted that myth. But myths, when made of meat, rot faster than parchment. Within weeks, the camp became a theater of imitation. The stench returned, thick and holy. The sick walked proud. The strong grew quiet. Those who still cared for their health were mocked, seen as vain, soft, worldly. To stink was to be spiritual. To itch was to be chosen. To limp was to be halfway to sainthood. And if your breath could peel bark off a tree, you were a prophet. The commanders despaired. They tried enforcing discipline. Daily inspections, soap rations, confiscation of armor for cleaning. But it was too late. The men obeyed, but only on the surface. They wore the clean armor and pissed in it anyway. They bathed in the river, but soiled themselves the next day. One man swallowed charcoal just to blacken his tongue. He looked more divine, the others said, like he'd spoken to something darker than man. They were not soldiers anymore. They were pilgrims in reverse. Instead of walking toward light, they marched into shadow, believing that the deeper they sank, the more worthy they became. And in that shadow, they found communion, because rot unites. More than creed, more than coin. To decay together is to share a secret language, one of moans, of muttered curses, of shared boils and blister remedies. They swapped tailies of pus like poets swap metaphors, compared scab patterns the way others compare battle scars. There was no shame, only admiration, no disgust, only envy. The new squire, barely 13, tried to clean his knight's cloak one morning, scrubbed it furiously with river water and rosemary, trying to erase the yellow ring of sweat at the neck. The knight struck him, not hard, but hard enough. "You insult the memory," he whispered. The squire cried that night, not from pain, but from confusion. No one consoled him. They said he would understand in time, and he did. By winter, he had stopped cleaning anything. He stopped brushing the horse, let the saddle crust with dried blood and mud. He no longer wept when asked to scrape the pus from his knight's back. He no longer covered his mouth when vomiting from the smell. He began to speak in shortened sentences. And one day, without realizing it, he wore the same tunic 3 weeks in a row. When another squire mentioned it, he smiled. A real smile. He was becoming. The rot, you see, was never just physical. It was spiritual erosion. A slow replacement of mercy with martyrdom, of hygiene with holiness. It began in the body, but ended in the mind. By the time the knights stopped bleeding, they had already disappeared. Only the armor remained, and within it, echoes. Wet, rancid, sacred echoes. And yet glory remained, not despite the rot, because of it. There are stories that die when the tongue grows silent, and there are stories that ferment when no one dares speak them aloud. The tale of the rotting knights belonged to the latter. It did not fade with burial, nor vanish beneath fresh armor. It curdled, hardened, fossilized into a legend that stank of truth no one wanted to confront. And so, in the shadow of the siege that had long since ended, the scent remained. Not just in fabric or tent canvas, not just in the black mold crawling up the chapel walls. It clung to memory like damp clings to bone. The camp had been moved again and again. They blamed wind, they blamed superstition, they blamed the devil. But deep down, they knew. You cannot outrun rot when it lives inside the very shape of your sainthood. They burned the tent eventually, the one where he had died, poured oil over the wooden posts, tore down the canvas with bare hands, and struck flint without ceremony. It lit faster than they expected. As if the fire had been waiting, teeth bared, hungry for filth it had not been allowed to cleanse. The flames rose and howled, and danced with a kind of fury that looked too human. For a moment, the men stepped back. Some crossed themselves. One swore he saw a shape inside the fire. Not the knight. Not exactly, but something shaped like him. Not moving, just watching. When the ashes cooled, they buried them. Quietly. No marker. No blessing. As though even the memory of the tent had to be sealed. But smoke doesn't forget where it rose from. And when the wind shifted at night, it carried back something more than smell. It carried reminders. It was in those weeks that the armorers began to speak less. They used to hum while they worked. Iron on iron, sparks flying, voices singing off-key tavern songs. Now, silence. They worked with gloves, even in heat. They oiled every seam like they were apologizing. They looked into the helmets before they closed them, as if to ask forgiveness for what came next. And the squire's gods, the squires had changed too. They tied straps looser now, not because it helped the knights fight, but because it made it easier to remove the armor if something happened. You see, when death no longer comes from the sword, but from the sweat beneath it, everyone begins to fear steel, not as salvation, but as suffocation. Knights began to fear their own harnesses. Some refused to wear full suits, claimed it was tactical, lighter, quicker. But the truth was simpler. They had seen too many men die not from wounds, but from what festered in silence beneath the plate. The stories bled into armor, like vinegar into cloth. Every stain a whisper, every rivet a reminder. Even newly forged suits smelled old, somehow. Smelled like the future, trying to forget the past. They tried to break the curse with ceremony. A new code, a new vow. Ritual bathings before battle, mandated, public inspections. The bishop even blessed every new helm with holy water thick with crushed rosemary. The men nodded, smiled, performed. But when dusk fell and the bishop left, they slipped into old habits. Skipped the bath. Let the socks dry on the line, still full of blood. They wrapped sores instead of treating them. Because somewhere, deep in the marrow of the myth, they still believed that pain was currency, that rot was ritual, that the stench was a price paid for remembrance. The new generation came hungry. Boys of 15, 16, barely old enough to hold a lance. They came with stars in their eyes and piss in their boots, ready to carve names into legend. But legends come with fine print. No one warned them about the dreams. No one told them that once you hear a man coughing blood through steel, it never leaves your ears. That once you scrub maggots from the lining of a greave, every meal tastes a little less like food. That once your master dies, smiling in silence, with a fever of 40 and pus in his eye, you don't pray the same way again. You don't clean your hands the same way again. One boy asked if it was true about the knight who rotted from within and rose again before dying a second time. His commander looked at him, then at the fire, and said, "That knight was cleaner than most," and the boy said nothing more. There were no more funerals after that winter, just burnings. Quick, efficient, without words. The priests began to stay away. Said the rites could be spoken from a distance. Said the soul doesn't need to hear them with ears. But truth hides in avoidance. They no longer wanted to get close. The line between man and corpse had grown too thin. When spring returned, it brought heat, not warmth. Oppressive, wet, clinging heat that turned armor into ovens. Men fainted not from wounds, but from suffocation. The padded gambesons soaked through by mid-morning. The cloth inside the helms blackened with mildew by week's end. Men began to shave their heads to avoid lice, only to find the lice had learned to live in eyebrows, in beards, even in the edges of the ears. The rot had evolved, refined itself. It no longer needed wounds. It could thrive in the folds between the fingers, in the webbing of toes, in the shadows cast by pride. One knight, known for his discipline, began to clean obsessively. He boiled water every morning, scrubbed his armor until it shone, changed his linens twice daily. The others laughed, called him the Silver Saint. But then he stopped showing up to drills. They found him one morning seated in his tent, armor on, unmoving, dead, but not from filth, from exhaustion, from infection hidden in a place he never thought to look inside his mouth. A cavity turned abscess, a river of bacteria down his throat. Died clean, died early, and the men stopped laughing. They said nothing for days. Then they began to whisper a new phrase. Choose your rot. It spread quickly. Choose your rot. Meaning, pick how you die. Will it be from outside or inside? From sword or sweat? From dirt you see or dirt you don't? Choose your rot. It was a joke at first. Then it became a prayer. And that prayer traveled. It passed from camp to camp, from squire to knight, from knight to priest. They stopped trying to erase the story. Instead, they wrapped it around themselves like a second skin, tighter than armor, heavier than steel, because it explained what nothing else could, that glory always leaks, that heroism, when sealed too long, turns septic. And still they wore the suits, still they strapped the greaves, still they marched. Because even when you know the armor will kill you, it's the only thing that makes you visible. And to die invisible is the only fate worse than rot. Rot, like any ritual, begins to speak in symbols. It doesn't knock, it seeps. It doesn't arrive, it accumulates. And the longer you wear it, the harder it is to remember when it first began whispering. Was it the day the armor was strapped too tight and left too long? The night the water ran out and no one bothered to fetch more? The morning your skin itched but no one looked? No, the truth is simpler. The rot doesn't begin at one moment. It begins when the body becomes an afterthought and the image becomes sacred. And nowhere was that clearer than the parade. It was spring again, the kind that fools men into forgetting the winter. A victory had been won, and banners unfurled like tongues of fire across the fields. Drummers beat rhythms that masked the groans of exhausted men. The city gates opened wide, and the crowd screamed their lungs raw. It was supposed to be triumph. It was supposed to be beautiful. And it was if you didn't stand too close. Because up front, beneath the plate and the pennants, the night smelled like the end of the world. Their horses limped beneath them, tails crusted with weeks of waste. Their surcoats bore more stain than symbol. The gold thread was dulled with dried pus. The chainmail clinked not with power, but with the brittle sound of rust cracking open like old scabs. And their faces, those faces blistered, cracked, white with salt from dried sweat. Some had no eyebrows left. Some had eyes that watered constantly, as if even their own gaze rejected what they'd become. But the people cheered, because they didn't know. Because distance, as ever, makes legends smell like roses. One child ran up to touch a knight's boot. The squire kicked him away. Not out of cruelty, but mercy. He'd seen what happened to skin that lingered too close to the steel. It picked up whatever lived inside. And what lived inside was not asleep. After the parade, the knights were given chambers in the royal wing. Fine beds, clean sheets, pitchers of wine and honeyed bread. The kind of comfort that used to mean healing. But they didn't undress. They sat on the edge of the beds like statues. Armor still buckled, boots still wet. One knight removed his gauntlet and stared at the hand beneath. The skin was mottled, white, flaking. The fingernails were soft. One fell off just from the air touching it. He did not flinch. He wrapped it back in cloth and put the gauntlet back on. That night, a physician was sent, young, eager. He entered with notes and fresh bandages. He left vomiting. Said the smell was not of death, but of something pretending to be alive. No one sent another. The king held a banquet in their honor. Of course he did. He couldn't smell what they brought into his hall. The wine flowed, the music danced, and the knights sat stiff, sweating through their armor, jaws clenched against the screams their bones wanted to make. One tried to stand to toast. His leg gave out. The hall fell silent. A servant rushed to help him up, and recoiled when his hand came away, slick with something he would not name. They propped the knight back up, and the king, confused but gracious, called for more wine. The banquet ended in applause. And next morning, 3 servants were ill. No one connected it. No one ever did, because the cause wasn't visible. It was embedded. It wasn't poison on a plate. It was centuries of neglect baked into a cultural icon, now leaking through seams. One knight died in his chamber that night. They said it was fever. But the mattress told a different story. The stench couldn't be washed out. They burned the bed. The queen ordered the room sealed. And still, the walls held on to the memory. Some say the stone began to darken. Others say the next dog to sleep there howled for 3 nights. But the worst part wasn't the room. It was what the other knights said when they heard the news. They didn't mourn. They nodded. One simply said, "He earned it." Not a life, not peace, the rot. He earned the rot. Because now it had become a badge. A proof. You are not truly a knight unless something inside you had begun to liquefy. Unless you limped. Unless your scent cleared a corridor. Unless your armor stuck to your wounds like barnacles to hull. Unless the rot had chosen you. They began to refuse healers, laughed at herbal remedies, spat at soap. They considered themselves beyond help. Not out of despair, but devotion. They had confused surrender with sacrifice, had mistaken disease for divine refinement. When one knight collapsed in the courtyard and vomited blood that shimmered with bile, another knight said, "That's what loyalty looks like." But loyalty to what? Not king, not kingdom, not even God. Loyalty to the armor, to the image, to the illusion that they had to die rotting or not be remembered at all. That's the cost of myth when you wear it too long. It becomes a skin that will not shed. It teaches you to rot beautifully, to decay with conviction. And no one, not even the gods, can pry it off without tearing you apart. And so they stayed in their armor, even when it buckled inward, even when their spines screamed against the curve, even when their breath became shallow and hot, and the visor collected spit they were too weak to wipe away. They stayed, because undracing would mean returning to the body. And the body, now, was unworthy. Their legend outgrew their lungs. And when the coughing started again, new this time, from another night, another room, they didn't send for help. They sent for more polish. You can only wear death for so long before it stops knocking. Eventually, it moves in. Not loudly, not with ceremony. Just a quiet slide into the place where your breath used to live, curling its fingers around your ribs, like an old friend who's finally come to stay. And in that moment, long after the victories, long after the feasts, long after the cheering has faded into stories, you're not a knight anymore. You're just a man sitting in metal you can't take off, praying your next cough doesn't come up red. He knew it. The last of them. Not the last night, no. There would be others. But the last one who remembered what it felt like to be clean. His name isn't carved anywhere, because names can't hold this kind of weight. But he sat in a stone chair, overlooking a field where grass hadn't grown since the first parade. His armor was intact, mostly. The joints didn't bend as they used to. The straps had been replaced with rope. The gauntlet was tied on with twine, because the leather had rotted decades ago. He didn't speak much anymore. But when he did, the air stopped moving. Because he was the only one left who didn't pretend it had all been worth it. They came to him, sometimes the younger ones. Still shining, still fresh, their swords still more decoration than weapon. They came for his blessing, or perhaps his silence, or perhaps to measure the distance between myth and man. He didn't offer advice. He didn't offer stories. He simply unfastened one buckle. Just one. Peeled back the neck guard. And let the smell answer for him. None of them returned a second time. But still they walked away with straight backs. Because that was the trick of it, wasn't it? The closer you got to the truth, the more your pride tried to deny it. So they kept wearing their armor longer. They started refusing to sleep outside of it. Some began to file their nails into points. No tactical reason, just affectation. The bishop anointed their blades, but not their bodies. The body was unclean. The body was failure. Only what wrapped it mattered now. Somewhere along the line, the tailors stopped making undergarments. No one asked for them anymore. The padding between skin and steel was a relic of softness. Now they went bare. Skin to chain, chain to bone. If it bled, it meant you were getting closer. Closer to what? No one could say. But they all nodded like they knew. One knight stitched thorns into his collar, so he'd bleed whenever he turned his head. Another lined the inside of his boots with sand. One wore a helm too tight on purpose. They called it discipline, but it was just devotion gone septic. And what happens to a world that forgets where pain ends and myth begins? The cooks stopped seasoning the meat. No one tasted anything anymore. The barbers stopped offering their services. The knights shaved only when the lice got too bold. And even then, they'd burn their hair instead of cutting it. The smell was horrendous. But it was the only fire they still believed in. Even the horses knew. They reared less, obeyed less. Their eyes grew wilder. You could smell their nerves. They didn't want to carry the men anymore. Not because they were tired, but because they knew what was growing inside the saddles. The rot had changed its language. It had gone from womb to culture. It no longer needed flesh to spread. It just needed faith. There was one knight, bless him, who tried to undo it. Just once. He removed his armor, all of it, bathed in front of the camp. Scrubbed it until the water ran pink. He shaved, cut his nails, washed his hair, washed his horse, replaced his linens. He even poured wine on his boots just to kill the smell. He returned to formation clean, almost glowing. He was dead by week's end. Not from war, not from infection. They found him in his tent, a sword through his throat. No sign of struggle, just a small scrap of parchment by his hand. No words, just a drawing, a knight kneeling, his armor off, head bowed. Underneath, one symbol, a circle crossed with an X. No one claimed responsibility. No one had to. Because by then, the armor wasn't protection. It was uniform. It was doctrine. Removing it was heresy. And the stink was scripture. The priests stopped preaching hygiene, stopped recommending penance for filth. They started embracing it, called it the odor of faith, said the smell of a knight's cloak was proof of divine purpose. The altar boys began wearing bits of chainmail during Mass, just on the shoulders at first, then the wrists, then the legs. By the end of that year, the bishop himself wore a helm for every Sunday sermon, said it helped him speak, with fire in the breath. And fire, indeed, began to return. But not the fire of cleansing, not the fire of renewal. The pyres came back. This time, not for the dead, for the armor. One night, during a fit of fever, stripped naked and begged to be burned with his gear. Said he couldn't get the smell out of his dreams. Said it followed him into his teeth, into the space behind his eyelids. They granted his wish. He laughed as the flames took him. Said it was the first time he'd felt warmth that didn't scream. After that, others followed. Voluntary burnings, always silent, always in full view of the camp. No screams, just slow heat, and the soft popping of skin too long sealed. And then the armor melted, and then the silence returned. But the stink never left, because legend, once fed, doesn't die. It digests, slowly, and these men, they had given it everything. Blood, skin, mind, memory, sense. All in the name of a glory that had become so diseased it could no longer walk unassisted. It limped on the backs of dying men. It coughed through their throats. It itched in their groins. It whispered through the cracks in their helmets. And yet, they smiled. Not all the time, but when it was darkest. When the sky split with thunder, and the camp reeked of meat and mildew. When the lice were biting. When the fever dreams returned. When the last clean blanket had been pissed on by a drunk squire. That's when they smiled. Because they knew they were too far gone now to go back. Too holy to be healed. Too righteous to be rinsed. They had become what the world expected of them. Living relics wrapped in rust, broken bodies carrying whole myths, incense burners of infection. And no one, not king, not pope, not the very gods they claimed to serve, could stop them. Because by then, they didn't believe in gods anymore. Only armor. Only rot. Only the truth that stank louder than any lie ever told. And so now we sit here, you and I, not beside a battlefield or a cathedral, but in the aftertaste of it all. The feast is long over, the corpses long buried, some in consecrated ground, others in whatever dirt would take them. The armor has rusted past recognition. The names have faded from the stones. And still, something lingers. Something thick and warm and metallic at the back of the throat. Not a memory. Not quite. Something heavier. Something you carry without knowing it, like breath that's gone stale from holding it too long. That is what remains of the knights. Not valor. Not virtue, but vapor. A scent no scripture could ever cleanse. Because once you rot in armor, you do not rise from it. You harden. You calcify. You become the very myth that ground you into pulp. And what is myth but a perfume over a wound? A desperate mask. A final lie whispered just loud enough to drown out the stench of truth. They called them holy, noble, symbols. But they were not symbols. They were containers. Sealed flesh tight in steel, left to boil in their own illusions, praying to gods that answered only in boils and brain fevers. And still they smiled. The last one died alone. Of course he did. There was no squire to change his linens. No priest to murmur over the slime of his breath. No one to peel off the final layer of plate fused to his thigh by dry blood in prayer. He had stopped speaking months before. Stopped writing, stopped eating, stopped unbuckling his greaves when the rot began to bloom between his toes like delicate white mushrooms. He hadn't needed to speak. His presence was enough. They still bowed when he passed. Not because he demanded it, but because something inside them folded without asking. That's what rot does when it's respected. It becomes hierarchy. His final breath wasn't a gasp. It was a sigh. Soft, long, as though even death approached gently, unsure if it had the right to touch someone so thoroughly claimed a legend already. They found him in the same stone chair, armor welded to his bones by time and ritual, mouth slightly open, as if tasting the air one last time for dust, for blood, for the story he was leaving behind. They didn't bury him. They built around him, bricked the room shut, called it a shrine, sealed the rot into sacred silence. And for a while, that worked. But you know how time works. You've seen it. It doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. It doesn't leave bones untouched or lies unpeeled. And so the story crept back. Not the version carved in stained glass, where knights kneel cleanly and angels descend with spotless swords. No, the real version. The one you've heard tonight. The one that smells like gangrene and glory. The one that itches at the back of your scalp even now, as you remember how long it's been since you touched clean water. Because what they never told you is this: rot doesn't stay in armor. It leaps. It hops from steel to symbol, from symbol to word, from word to boy. And when that boy grows into a man who wears courage like a costume and silence like a skin, he too begins to smell. Not outside. No, that would be too easy. He smells inside. Beneath the ribs, behind the tongue, in the folds of his dreams. He forgets to breathe when no one's watching. He forgets to cry when the pain starts. He walks a little taller to make up for how hollow he feels. He thinks it's pride, but it's just rot. We buried the knights, but we kept their rituals. We don't call them rituals anymore. We call them work ethic. Call them tradition. Call them resilience. We wear our burnout like chainmail. We bleed privately. We itch silently. We smile publicly. And we rot quietly, just like they did. Just like we were told was noble. But you sitting there now, knowing all this, what will you do? Will you keep polishing your own armor, pretending the smell isn't getting stronger? Will you strap on more weight in the name of meaning, knowing your back has already begun to bend? Will you raise your sons to be steel instead of soil? Will you tell your daughters to pray for knights or pray for mercy? Or will you do something blasphemous? Will you undress? Will you step out of the armor? Will you let the air touch what's raw? Will you scrub the blood out of the lining, even if it's dried into your name? Will you say no to the polish, no to the pain as pride, no to the myth that asked you to trade your body for a monument? Because it's not too late, you know. Not for them, they're gone, but for you. And you don't have to rot in armor to matter. You don't have to stink of self-denial to be brave. You don't have to turn into a statue just so people will call you strong. You can breathe. You can bleed out loud. You can heal without hiding. You can take the damn armor off. No one will sing songs about it, but you'll live. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember how to smell like a body again. Not a myth. Not a martyr. Just a human. Still soft. Still flawed. Still alive. And that, perhaps, is the bravest thing of all.